It's hardcore history.
The Blitz Edition.
These shows that we do are improvised. There's no script. I'll usually come in the studio, remember where we were the day before, write down some thoughts that might have occurred to me in just sort of maybe bullet point form or whatever, and then we improvise. And if we don't like it, we throw it away. If we do like it, it strings together with the stuff we did previously. But the reason that matters is I don't have a real roadmap or idea of how what we're about to start here is going to go. We take this journey together, and then you look at what you have and say, oh, what is that? There's no chance to, go over the script later, double check things, decide if this works or that doesn't, time it out. None of that is available to us. And I think that's partially why it sounds kind of different than a lot of the similar productions. But this is part of how we've always done it, right? So I don't know how this is going to go. The people that have advised me that I've divulged what I'm going to talk about today, the people that I've talked to have told me it is not going to go well. It doesn't matter what I do. It's not going to go well. They said you should not touch this topic. It is a no-win situation. Just go do one of the crowd pleaser topics. There's so many, that people will love. And I wrote down a quote that sort of summed up the problem and the reason that those people are saying that. It's attributed, I always say that now because every quote is somehow debunked. Nobody ever said anything they're quoted as saying in history, apparently. But the Ohio State University historian Robert C. Davis is quoted as saying that history is, often as not, our present politics projected onto the past. And you can see that easily. I mean, that is an obvious statement when you go and look at, for example, the brand new books that are coming out on certain historical things and how they'll tend to they'll tie it in. It's something that the editors want, right? Tie it into the current events. I mean, it's encouraged. But the problem is that means a lot of the material that you might use to discuss this topic that everyone tells me not to discuss today is going to be woven into the political, anger of our current times, right? The zeitgeist. And if there's one thing we've seen in our current times is a big part of the problem is that no one accepts the sources of the other side, and that the first thing you say in any discussion is, who are your sources? And the minute you don't like them, it's discussion over. But this is one of those subjects that everyone should have as part of their sort of foundational knowledge. As my mother always used to say, she would say, intelligent people know these things, right? So a certain bedrock of a knowledge base. And you might not get any higher than that from me, because that's another reason that maybe you want to steer clear of the show like this, is because it's monumentally huge, and a person like yours truly is completely inadequate to dealing with it. I always hope that I can be one little tile in the giant mosaic that is the picture here, and that tile has something to offer that's unique. So one of the things I thought, anticipating the criticism here and wanting people, if they don't already, because many of you are going to know all of this stuff, wanting people to have this knowledge base, is that I was going to steer clear of any of the controversial sources. Now, you miss out when you do that. You lose a lot of the cutting-edge ideas. You lose a lot of the pushing the envelope stuff, some very interesting things. At one point, I thought maybe I'll do a compare and contrast sort of deal. Well, that quickly became something that was at too high of an intellectual level for yours truly also. So I thought, I'm going to approach this like a Blitz show topic, where we sort of dive in and dive out, and I highlight things that I think are interesting or important. It's not chronological. It's not a history of, but it's something that when I look at my archive seems like a glaring omission. It's the discussion of the Atlantic slave trade and that period in history, and some of the ideas that are out there and some of the thoughts that matter, and some questions that I think are, well, I want to say that they're interesting, but some of them I would say are almost the obvious things to ask, and no one asks them, which is, maybe I'm in the wrong there. Maybe they're not that foundational. Otherwise, other people would have asked them. But you can be the judge of that, assuming that without this script, we ever get to that. Now, we did a show quite a while back called Addicted to Bondage that looked at the overall human institution of slavery going back, to the very beginnings of civilization. It wasn't as in-depth as that makes it sound, but it was more of a holistic look at the slavery question than dealing, and I think it specifically tried to avoid the more recent version that was specifically mostly African in nature, to give a sense of how common this thing was in human history all over the world. And then we examine the sorts of reasons that might be, and you get into these borderline upsetting sorts of lenses to look at it. But when I was a kid, and this is what we said in the Addicted to Bondage episode, they were always promising the kitchen of tomorrow today. All these labor-saving devices were going to take all the drudgery of life away from you so you could go enjoy your golf game or whatever it was. Radar ranges, stuff like that. But as we had said in Addicted to Bondage, the ancients and the people in earlier eras and the people in some places still today, they have the kitchen of yesterday today, and it's just as good. But instead of labor-saving devices that are mechanical, they have people that do the same job. Slaves were one of the original labor-saving devices. And when you read the views of slaveholders in slave societies, they will often connect it to the highest aspirations of mankind as a whole, right? It's people who do the slave-type jobs that free up the people that push society forward and think and write and come up with all these, pieces of art that otherwise would not be available because they'd have to go to, the grocery store in the morning. The marketplace would probably be more apropos, and pick up the stuff for tonight's dinner and then make it, right? And then clean up after it. Otherwise, how are we going to have time to write and read? You'll see that all the way into post-colonial times in the United States, right? This is how societies push forward. Even, famous Athens in the era where it was democratic, right? It's sort of the shining city on the democratic hill for people looking back at the beginnings of things like democracy. It was an enormous slave state. Nice chunk of its population was enslaved. So what was once referred to as a peculiar institution, slavery, is not. We live in the strange time now, a time where slavery is universally reviled. Now, I did read that there were more than 40 million people classified as slaves right now in the world, which, if true, would make it almost certainly this period in human history where there were the most slaves. 40 million is a lot. But sometimes the criteria is, let's call it slavery on a sliding scale, and that isn't meant to be trite, but there's all kinds of slavery, and it's sort of on a gradient. On one end, you have things like, wage slavery, as some people would say, right? People that are trapped in jobs that don't make them enough money to live, but they get paid. Then you have things like bond slavery, debt slavery, which is really the same thing, indentured servitude, all the way down to the lowest level of slavery on the gradient, chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is where we take human beings and we make them things. Maybe it would be more apropos, rather than comparing them to a hammer or a chair, to compare them to some sort of animal you'd find on a farm. That's how, because the slave owners would often try to keep them healthy the same way you would try to keep some livestock healthy, but it's, you own them. You can do whatever you want with them. That's chattel slavery. Serfdom, peasantry, there's all kinds of these things that would fall somewhere in the category, but chattel slavery is the lowest of the low, and that's the kind of slavery that the world had going on when Christopher Columbus found the New World for the Europeans in the Old World. How about that? Europeans isn't even the proper term, because the Old World stretched from, the edges of Europe, right? Ireland, Western France, Western Spain, and what's now Portugal, right? Those are the edges of Europe, the Eurasian continent. And you follow it all the way through, though, and China on the other side is connected to this pipeline and everything in between. Now, there's not close contact, but silk is making it one way, money's making it the other. In other words, that there are things like diseases, foods, codes of conduct and morality that are shared. The Mongols alone in the 1300s, 1200s would have been spreading a lot of this stuff against everybody else's will. So when Columbus rolls up into the New World, the so-called New World, and lands, the person that is landing there is a person from the Middle Ages. And this is important to point out. Now, Columbus was a bad guy, I think, when you look at his conduct as judged by the people of his day. At the same time, it's hard to imagine somebody else showing up and all of a sudden behaving radically different, right? Even if they were not as ruthless as someone like Columbus, how much different are they going to behave, and how much different is that going to make everything that follows afterwards? But the important thing to remember is, if you look, and I always do this, if you look at when Columbus was born, in other words, the world he was born into, I think he was born in the 1450s. The 1450s is like the War of the Roses in England. Go look at a picture, a painting of what people were looking like in the Wars of the Roses era. These are knights. This is medieval combat. We haven't even yet, or we're just in Columbus's day, progressing to the point where we're getting into that period where you have the Inquisition and people being burned. I mean, look at what life is like for these people in the world Columbus was born into. They break people on the wheel. The executions are public. I mean, so what sort of person was going to show up in the New World and just, by modern standards, behave? Right, that was an ugly world that they were coming from. And as I said, not, it's tempting these days, people will blame it on Europe, but I mean, this is the way it is in North Africa, what's now the Middle East, Europe, of course, Russia, China, the Mongolian area, India. I mean, this is a shared understanding of man's inhumanity to man, and things like slavery, well, it's everywhere. And it's an equal opportunity atrocity. In Columbus's day, before he finds the so-called New World, slavers were more likely to care about the slaves' religious affiliation than their skin color. The Christians in Spain would enslave the Moors across into North Africa, the North African peoples who are like Moroccans and Algerians today. And those people would enslave the Christians as well. The Turks had lots of slaves. The Arabs had lots of slaves. The Italians had slave markets. The Russians had slaves. The Mongols enslaved everyone. The Chinese had slaves. The Indians had slaves. They had slavery in sub-Saharan Africa, so-called Black Africa. And they had slavery in the Americas before Columbus even got there. Similar pattern to the rest of the world, too. Some peoples had it, some peoples didn't. Amongst the peoples that did practice slavery, it was on the slavery gradient scale, too. I mean, there were, and you'll often hear people sort of try to defend these tribes as not really being slave-owning tribes, because the slave was more like a family member who couldn't leave and had to do whatever they were told, but that is a little different on the slavery gradient scale than someone who's captured in war and is a slave who's held as raw fodder for some human sacrificial religious event that is upcoming, right? You're going to be the star of the show. And needless to say, things like skin color did not play a role because the peoples of the Americas were basically, close to each other's skin color. It wasn't playing a large role at the time Columbus arrived in the Old World yet either. Anyone could become a slave, as we'd said. I mean, anyone in Columbus's crew could have found themselves on a ship captured by pirates or slavers, end up in some slave market on a Mediterranean island, find themselves auctioned off, and a galley slave in the Sultan's fleet or something like that. White slavery, as it was called. The pulp comic books of the 20th century play on that a lot, right? Especially the women who ended up in the Sultan's harem, the white women. It was such a racial trope. But during this time period, there was some of that, and the Turks had Christian slave soldiers, which is a different slave level on the slavery gradient scale, too. There could be some really powerful slaves who owned lots of slaves. I mean, the slavery thing defies easy classification. The bottom line, though, is one of the things where you start to say, okay, now, why did this happen? The interesting questions that come into play is, so how did this become a thing where all of a sudden a bunch of powers in the world were hooking black Africans up to the proto or early capitalist globalized supply chain and logistically figuring out ways to start a pipeline of human beings from the African continent over to the Americas. And there's obviously no easy answer to this, if there's any answer at all. It's not a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of question, certainly. So I started writing down, while scouring the history books, a bunch of the different ideas that were thrown out there as major influencing factors to this whole thing. And as my list got longer and longer and longer, I started to realize that this really isn't a list that's about slavery per se. You could better describe this ever-lengthening list of influential factors, discoveries, events as something that tries to explain what reality was like in the so-called old world in the 15th and 16th centuries, right? What the zeitgeist was like, what the economic system was like. In other words, what you can draw from that is that slavery is so interconnected in that world that you can't tease it out like a strand in a rope. It touches everything. It influences everything. It's such a basic part of the makeup of things that it's impossible to talk about the influential factors in the slave trade without just talking about the influential factors in life. The one thing that has always struck me about this era is because some of it, especially economically, begins to look like, well, there's a modernity to it. It's not the kind of economic system we have now, but we're clearly an evolved form of it, right? We're descendant from this system that's about to develop in the 1400s because it's the first truly globalized system, right? Because it's the first time that the so-called old world and the so-called new world are aware of each other. First time they're included in the economy. The first time you have a global economy, right? And yet the idea that you could take a kind of a proto-capitalism and inject human bondage as one of the commodities that it works with, the same way you would work with sugar or tobacco or oil today, it's bizarre. They seem to be from different eras. Like slavery should have already died out before we got to this level of ability to, maximize mercantile operations, right? We already decided that things like people shouldn't be the officially traded products on the New York Stock Exchange, right? And instead of, these old ideas going away because they don't fit into a new modern paradigm, what instead you see is a fusion, don't you, of this very ancient human institution of bondage mixing with the proto-modern economic system of the Renaissance, the first globalized. Sometimes you'll see history books call it a commercial revolution or a mercantilist revolution or a trade revolution, but an era where it would not be out of place, and I'm sure it's been done, and I feel like an idiot for not having checked it in advance, but I'm sure an economist could write this history in a way that it makes total sense, as crazy as that sounds. Right? If you take the human being part out of this and you just focus on numbers and trade and profit and loss, and you can make all of this kind of work. It's the moral part that screws up the whole slave trade thing. And if you want to be a historical optimist, you can say that there were events on a historical slavery timeline that look like there's progress happening here and there. People will eliminate slavery and do away with slavery and make rules that further constrict slavery. And I'm not saying they're not progress, but when you make rules, for example, I believe it was one pope that said that, Christians could be slave owners and Christians could be slaves, but here on after you can't have Christian slaves owned by non-Christian slaveholders. Now, anything is progress in the right direction, but this to me sounds more like we don't really have a problem with the idea of slavery. We just have a problem with people like us being enslaved. But again, not going to quibble with progress. Just going to point out that the historical optimists who want to make a point can point to some things that often, if you examine them on the ground with a critical eye, look, again, progress, but look more like you're promoting the lowest people in your society a level or two up on the slavery gradient scale, right? Maybe something from a chattel slave to a serf, or from a serf to a peasant, or from a peasant to an indentured servant. I'm not, again, saying it's not progress. But the historical pessimist would come back with, yes, doesn't seem to mean that much when you look at how many new peoples are going to be enslaved and how this is going to be turned into a machine. And perhaps you could compare the entire slave trade as it's always existed as a machine, right? Go to the Mediterranean. Those are old trade networks in people. I mean, take, for example, the Black Sea. The Black Sea is like a slave trading highway that you take them from the areas. Well, a lot of times it was the steppe people, the various tribes there would make a living raiding Slavic villages, stealing people, and then selling them. They'd be transported across the Black Sea, a lot of times to Constantinople, and from there to the Mediterranean. I mean, it's a trade network in people. But you add the modern stuff to it, and we have investors, right, and big firms, and it just, again, it could be told in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, this story. If you make human beings a legal commodity to trade, I mean, opium was that way for a while too. You just make it a legal commodity, then it is like sugar or tobacco or oil. And the mind reels, right? Oil doesn't feel pain, right? Oil doesn't suffer. Human beings do, though, right? And yet, supply and demand does as good of a job explaining some of this stuff as any other thing you can think of. I mean, look, we've talked about it before. I'm not a historian, and it's difficult to try to take the various strands in this story and rank them in a triage type of level of importance, right? This has happened, and then this was more important. I can't do that, but I can bring in some of the strands that were going on around this time period to provide the context, right? So let's go back to when we started about Columbus's birth period, because that's an interesting time, and there's a lot of things that are happening during that same time period. Now, start with the fact that there is the beginnings, as we all know, of something your history books call the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, and it was always associated with new ideas, or a better way to put it would be old ideas that were rediscovered. The rediscovery of classical civilization was the way my old history book used to, label it. Now, modern histories do a better job of, as I think I alluded to, pointing out that the people in Europe, for example, had gotten their hands on some of this ancient Greek and Roman stuff a couple of centuries earlier. They were pouring through the scientific side of this stuff, but at the Renaissance, they start getting, and they become popular, right? These works never died out. They were in small little enclaves of knowledge, including, in the Arabic language that gets retransmitted over, but it wasn't in wide general dissemination. And then during the Renaissance, all of these ancient Greek and Roman pre-Christian cultural and philosophical and artistic works sort of blow into the consciousness of the literate people in Europe, and it begins to change everything. And to find a historical analogy now is to tread into science fiction territory, because this is 1,000 years or more before the people of the Renaissance. Can you imagine finding a book 1,500 years old and it's got all this stuff we didn't know yet in it? Or calculations we didn't think about, or philosophical ideas that we've never been exposed to? And then this stuff reaches the internet hive mind and changes everything? That's kind of the crazy stuff behind the Renaissance rediscovery of classical civilization. But what's funny is part of the reason that this is new to the people in Europe at this time period is because they've been living with centuries of, one sort of mental construct that they were working with, which sort of excluded a lot of these their mental construct ideas, right? They lived in a very Christian world. One professor of mine described it once as a fanatical steaming cup of coffee that all of a sudden gets an injection of pre-Christian, cream or half and half into the mix, and you can imagine, what that does. The turbulence of the time period upcoming is in part influenced by all of these ideas that a bunch of people who had a very, 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 very Christian worldview, and one that was enforced. Remember, this was the kind of mental thing that if you deviated from it too much, you would find yourself in dire, dire, dire straits. You could find yourself burned in this period for having a worldview too far off the beaten path, right? So to all of a sudden bring in these people who were immune from punishment. I mean, you can't burn Aristotle at the stake, but all of a sudden people might read it. Aristotle, by the way, is not a bad person to pivot off of this, because one of the things that the rediscovery of classical civilization did was expose the Renaissance Europeans to this idea that slavery is just fine, right? I mean, if you're trending away from slavery, but all of a sudden, and I remember reading one historian who described the Renaissance love affair with the classical Greeks and Romans, or an infatuation with them, right? And you're looking at this great civilization that was so great that you could actually read stuff from 1,000 years ago that they created, and it's better than your stuff, or more interesting, or different, or stimulating, or you hadn't thought of that, right? What accounts for such a great society? And there's this little bit of, wondering what the secret sauce of classical civilization is. And the people in this time period couldn't help but notice that these societies, whether you're talking about the ancient Athenians or whether you're talking about these are slave states. Maybe slavery's got something to do with it. And then you start reading some of the ancient Greek justifications for slavery and some of the Roman justifications for slavery, and you can't help but notice that these will become like the standard justifications that you will hear all the way up into like the United States antebellum 1850 era or something. You're still hearing the lines that, listen, slavery's good for the slaves. What was that philosopher's line? Better to be ruled by the reason of another than no reason at all, right? You'd be better off listening to your master's decisions on life, because you'll be a happier person than if you made your own decisions, because you're not rational. The other idea that comes from the ancient Greek philosophers, this idea that some people are just born slaves, right? There's, it's like created from birth. The gods willed it, or what have you. Some of you are born Greek, some of you are born barbarians. The barbarians are the slaves. Then there's that other idea from classical civilization, which was absolutely adopted by later slave states, and that's that slavery was good for everybody because it allowed society's cream of the crop — I'm not sure what the right word to use for these people are, but society's best and brightest, right, the most enlightened thinkers and statesmen and whatever it might be. It allows those people the time to concentrate on what only they can do. Frees them, because they were slaves, to do all the drudgery work, right, to make them the money on the farm, whatever it might be. Frees them to push society forward. Only by being a man of leisure could these people play their role in society, just like the slave plays their role in society. And you can almost see a cosmic organization to it all, can't you? See how it all fits together. The point being is, at a time period where maybe a historical optimist could see signs that, along with this new modern world, maybe there'll be a more modern view of human relations when it comes to things like slavery. And then all of a sudden you get this intellectual competition, right? A school of philosophy that kind of, by way of example, argues for just the opposite, right? Well, it didn't hurt Greece or Rome to have all those slaves. You also begin to run into a terrible, this could be on the Wall Street Journal pages too, but it's a terrible supply and demand situation that various developments in this day and age seem to offer a resolution for. So let me explain. Let's go back to Columbus's birth again, right? So 1450-ish, 51, 52, right in there. By this time, there have been advances in European ocean-going travel. That's a good way to put it, right? Ocean-going exploration. And this is, of course, one of the more interesting things in all your history books. To go from a situation where, for the most part, human beings would hug coastlines with naval vessels, to going into the open ocean, right? Venturing forth into the Atlantic or the Pacific or what have you, the Indian Ocean. Now, and this is part of their charm and what blows you away about them, Polynesians in canoes, Vikings in long ships, they had famously done this stuff. But there's a difference between some of that and the sort of regular ongoing commerce that will be initiated by, man's venturing forth into the open oceans with big ships. And when you go read the accounts from when this first starts, right? So go to what's now Portugal, right? Kingdom of Portugal, Kingdom of Castile, all these places sort of on the most western part of the European peninsula, along with Ireland. And you read their early accounts of venturing forward with the ships. If you look at a map, it looks like they're going almost nowhere. You want to say to yourself, really, that's a big deal, going from, the coast of Portugal to that little island right there? It's only a half inch on my map, something like that. But back in those days, there was a very good chance if you went off into the open ocean, even a short distance away, you weren't coming home. And it was the coming home with regularity part that changed everything. And it was different ship designs, different navigational tools, different theories, a bunch of really intrepid individuals who would go a little bit farther than last time and then a little bit farther than that. You can go see a timeline of Portuguese investigation off of their coast to the islands nearby, then the coast of Africa. And, every year you can see they're like going a little bit farther down the west coast of Africa, then eventually they'll round the tip, go up the other side, eventually cross the Indian Ocean. This does a whole lot of things, obviously, right? The first thing it does, though, is open up a direct channel to Central and Southern Africa, so-called Black Africa, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. Europeans and Sub-Saharan Africa have always been connected, just not directly, right? So if Africans from Sub-Saharan Africa move across their continent up to the Mediterranean Sea and get transported to slave markets in Italy, for example. I mean, that all happens, but it's very different than having a direct, European correspondence with the great African kingdoms south of the Sahara Desert, right? And the Sahara Desert's one of the big reasons that that's not happened before this time. It's 75, 80 days to travel across the Sahara Desert in this time period, and it's a total death zone. Armies can't traverse it. I mean, there are some slave caravans and some trading caravans, but by and large, this is an enormous barrier. And then above that, if you look at a map, north of the Sahara Desert, if you're the Europeans trying to have direct contact with so-called Black Africa, you have another problem, and it's powerful North African states. Right? You have a barrier there. So first you have a powerful North African state blocking you from Central Africa, and then south of them you have the giant Sahara Desert. You could see why the sub-Saharan Africans and the Europeans required middlemen to do much interaction before this time period. But what's so monumentally different about this era is eventually the Portuguese making their way down the African coast get to the level that's south of where the Sahara Desert is. In other words, their ships make direct contact with sub-Saharan African kingdoms. And one of the first things that they do is grab some of the people that they see on the coastline, throw them in chains, and take them back to Portugal. So, a harbinger maybe of things to come. This is what's happening like right around Columbus's birth. And then in 1453, something famously happens that, once again, in a supply and demand conversation about global trading patterns and the price of investments and all these commodities, in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Turks. Now, if you go look at a map, Constantinople's modern-day Istanbul, right? It's old Roman city that becomes a later Roman city you would call a Byzantine city, maybe. And then in 1453, it gets taken finally by the Turks. And if you look at Istanbul today, you can see how it basically controls access to the Black Sea. It's the nozzle on the wineskin bag that is the Black Sea. And as we said earlier, the Black Sea is a major, major slave transport zone. I mean, this is how you get your so-called white slaves from the Slavic regions and all there, all the way down to the major slave markets. And when Constantinople falls, the Ottoman Turks cut off, they divert the slaves that were coming from that area to the major slave markets in the Mediterranean to their own areas, the Islamic areas in the Middle East and places like that, which had always had a lot of slaves anyway. But when they do this now, in our supply and demand situation, we have a supply squeeze, right? What would any good business person do if all of a sudden your access to raw materials were cut off or reduced? And that's a good way to look at this, too, because slavery, even though it's like currency, basically, I mean, people are like money, and you can get money for human beings. So in a straight-up currency trade, they're worth value that way. But they're also, if you consider it like a prime component of everybody else's business, it's the same way if energy prices went up, it ripples up and down everybody's life, doesn't it? It affects everything, the price of meat in the grocery stores, everything. So that's how this slave thing is, too, because everybody needs slaves. There's a relatively constant demand. And sometimes new enlightened policies end up making that situation even worse. For example, if you say something like, Christians shouldn't be slaves anymore, you just cut the market that's available, in that raw materials category, don't you? So this is a time period where there's a heavy-duty demand, supply gets curtailed, and anybody in their right mind is going to look for a new source of raw materials, and it's right around the same time period that the Europeans have made direct contact with sub-Saharan Africa, which has always been a big source of slaves. Not to the Europeans, to the Islamic states, for example. There was a big slave rebellion, lasted more than a decade, killed a ton of people in what's now modern-day Iraq, led by the black African slaves. 869 AD-CE, I believe, right? Big rebellion. But it shows you how long these trading patterns have been, working. I mean, if you're an African ruler and you defeat your opponent in war, you take the captives and you sell them. Or you make them your own slave, right? And this is not a universal thing. It just happens a lot. That's a good way to put anything, right? This is not universal. It just happens a lot. People could fall into slavery due to crimes and be punished by their own people. The bottom line is that at a certain point, the Europeans, and when we say that now, we really mean the Portuguese. I mean, the English are not doing this yet, for example, but the Portuguese start to realize that rather than steal your own men, that man-stealing is another term that they used to use for slavery, man-stealing, rather than steal your own people, you could just tap into the already existing trade network, make deals with rulers in these areas, and let them just cut you in for some of the slaves they're already capturing and selling to other people anyway. A lot of people are going to make a lot of money during this time period, and that's another thing that's worth dealing with, is one of those strands to try to unpack here, and it's a key reason why even people who had nothing to do with slavery ostensibly were impossible to disentangle from the slave trade, because money touched everything and connected everything. And you never want to say that money's not important, but in different time periods, things like currency and trade are more important than others. In the Europe after Rome fell, there was, if you could see, again, the business graphs of historic performance and economic output over the eras, that's going to be a kind of a down period. There were some places returned to more barter systems. Trade was curtailed. It was in the Middle Ages, again, the part that was percolating beneath the Renaissance and then exploded, where you started to see the merchant classes develop, and they became so powerful and they made enough money that they wanted to be more like blue bloods in the nobility. You started seeing the banking houses that would eventually be very powerful arise. You started seeing trade increase in places like the Baltic with the Hanseatic League and all that, and the rise of the Italian city-states, even during the Crusades, that were financing these things, right? So you begin to see modern systems of investment, right? And shareholders and all sorts of things that look, again, very modern indeed. You even see it affect everything like exploration and warfare. So this is a time period in history where a lot of places will just hire their defense forces. And usually they'll just, like in Italy, they'll hire a general. It's a condottieri, and that's a word that is connected to contract, right? So you hire him, you sign a contract, and they often come with their own armies. Everybody signs a contract. For 2 years, we will be the army of this Italian state. And this approach to dealing with things actually is involved in the Columbus explorations. This looks like a giant, well-invested, well-capitalized financial expedition. It's entrepreneurial colonialism in a sense. Columbus, if you follow his career, he went and gave presentations to potential investors. It's like right out of a Renaissance version of Shark Tank. Goes to these people and says, I have a proposal. I'm going to go in the other direction and reach Asia, and we can open up our own direct trade channels, right? This is a trade deal. This is a money-making thing. He's going to be like Pier 1 Imports, the 1492 style version of it. And he gets put off, and the investors don't think he's got his calculations right. But at one point, the rulers of Castile, who will eventually become the Spanish monarchy, they decide they like his idea enough that they don't want him taking it elsewhere. So they give him some money to sit tight on it. It's almost like a Renaissance version of a non-disclosure agreement or a non-compete. But when Columbus eventually undertakes this expedition, he's acting as an agent of the monarchy of Castile, right, the Spanish monarchy to be, but he's not the Spanish Navy. He's also getting a percentage deal. All right, well, a percentage deal doesn't sound like it's out of place when you're talking about establishing trade routes with already established great states in Asia. since that was the plan. It looks very different indeed when you stumble upon lands that are not what you thought and have people on it who cannot militarily resist you. Then if you're Columbus and you're getting a percent of whatever you find or put together or whatever this expedition turns out in terms of proceeds, what are your proceeds when you land in modern-day Haiti or Cuba? Well, it gets a little bit dicey, doesn't it? And once again, I think the angle I'd like to look at this from now, and we're going to change this angle over the course of this discussion, that we'll focus on different things at different times, but I'm trying to get into the, you know how impossible this is. We're playing a game here, right? Just little games to see if we can get a step closer to understanding things a little bit more in context with these people. I mean, if you take the human element out of this question, right? Forget about suffering and injustice and death and torture and all the things that this involves, and just think of it in, you know, a profit or loss sort of way. The story has, it's interesting how, as I said, it sort of falls into place. I mean, take Columbus to start with here for a second. Now, I've read some stuff recently that suggests that maybe the traditional interpretation of what Columbus was after may be wrong. I still think those are really outlier things, so I'm not going to go down that tangent. But I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, he may have told his investors one thing and had a different thing in mind. But the traditional impression given by Columbus himself, apparently, was that he was looking for another route to Asia. Why would he want this? Money. Okay, Asia is where, and Asia in air quotes, because these guys have like a Marco Polo level of understanding of Asia. What's more, it's like a time machine version. I was reading that one of the people they were hoping to hook up with was the Mongol Khan in order to make a sort of a trade deal with them, but they don't know the Mongol Khan's not in charge of the area anymore, right? Their information's like seeing the light of a star from so far away. You're seeing, you know, the past light of a star. Marco Polo is the past light of what Asia was, but they know that's where the good spices and all that stuff come from, right? Think of the money involved, the spices and all the good stuff from Asia, in air quotes. That stuff comes via a land route to the Mediterranean European part of the world. Caravans and all those sorts of things, and generally, you know, merchant to merchant to merchant handoffs, and we all know there's juice on each of those deals, right? So by the time it arrives in the I don't know what we want to call it, the Euro-Mediterranean theater, North Africa, that whole area, these spices are old, so they're not exactly fresh, and there have been a lot of markups along the way, so they're very, very expensive. I mean, what was the old television commercial with the Crazy Eddie guy? Cut out the middlemen and save. Had Columbus really made it to Asia, in air quotes, the middleman's gone, and the spices will arrive fresh, and you can tap into a completely ripe and ready to go and already operating, you know, trading operation, right? All you have to do is make a deal and give them something and fill your ships with the good stuff and head back home. Everybody makes a fortune. Easy to calculate Columbus's percentage then, right? Columbus has stumbled upon a completely different sort of business thing when he rolls up into the Caribbean. I had an investor once explain to me that he considers there to be two kinds of investments, and he called them green bananas and yellow bananas. Yellow bananas are investments that are going to be ripe quickly, that will pay off in the short term. Green bananas are the ones that require watering and fertilizing and pruning and maintenance and all sorts of investment to eventually turn into something that is paying off. Columbus was heading, if the Asia destination thing that we've always thought was true is true, Columbus was looking for a yellow banana deal, and he stumbled into a green banana deal. He has obviously found something valuable, and he's got to be giddy, don't you think? This was a guy that if you were betting on it, you were going to bet he was going to die somewhere on the way, you know, off the map to the west. So just surviving is a victory. Not having his crew mutiny because they think that they're never going to get to any destination, you know, throwing him overboard and then going home, or taking the ship and himself going home and then living in, you know, shame and disrepute and embarrassment. I mean, so this is a victory no matter what, but it's not what he was after, apparently, right? He's after an instant payoff. and he's arrived at something that's going to require some work. The good news is there's a labor force when he gets to the New World, and it's the indigenous people of the Americas, right? There's millions of them. We have already established the old world's attitudes about things like slavery and forced labor and all that kind of stuff. So it won't be any problem, deciding how to employ the indigenous labor one way or the other. But you've got people here to turn green bananas into yellow bananas, right? Create cash cows out of these places, extract all the good juice that these islands can produce, including sugarcane juice in a lot of them, tobacco juice in other ones. That's gross, tobacco juice. You can see, by the way, in the letters Columbus writes back, there's one you can read, you can find online where I guess he's writing the treasurer or something. These are the investor type people. And he's basically explaining, that we found great stuff and the potential's huge. And there's as much gold as you want, all this kind of stuff. It just is going to require a little bit more money. I mean, this is fully stuff that looks like one of those .com startup CEOs telling his old line investors, yeah, it's not exactly what we thought, but this is maybe even better. Just need a little bit more money, another round of financing. But he's laying out all this stuff that this new find that he's claimed for his employers in Spain, all these ways it's going to pay off. Gold and the stuff that you can grab off the natives' ears or trade for their bracelets or other jewelry. I mean, that's movable wealth right now. You have people, which, as we've already explained during this period, is movable wealth. And Columbus will quickly do a couple of voyages back and forth across the Atlantic, and he'll take indigenous peoples back with him to Spain, kind of to show off, listen, these people make great slaves or whatever, but they start dying quickly and in large numbers. And that's going to be the problem that crops up in this whole green banana long-term investment deal. The indigenous peoples who are going to be the labor force here are dying like flies from multiple causes. These causes are so fascinating, extreme, hardcore, intense, however you want to phrase it, that it takes every ounce of my strength without a script here to keep me anchored, to resist the Ouija board-like pull of the storytelling towards the unbelievably fascinating nature of, shall we call it, first contact fallout. I did a couple of takes where it just went off forever. I mean, you would have been justifiable if you'd said something like, I didn't like the show. I thought it was supposed to be about something else. So I'm trying to avoid doing that again. But it's worth pointing out that what creates the situation that leads to the Atlantic slave trade involves the fact that these indigenous peoples who otherwise would be the workforce aren't around anymore. And the number one reason, I don't know what 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would be ranked, but it's number one and then everything else. The number one reason for this is the germ-tastrophe. And the germ-tastrophe is, it's mind-boggling, science fiction like Twilight Zone. It's got all those elements that fascinate someone like me, but there's a little guilt in the fact that it's a Holocaust. And for the most part, it's a hidden Holocaust. The majority of the people affected and the victims of this are going to be in the interiors of the Americas, having caught these ailments from, other indigenous peoples through the trade routes and everything that they have going. And most of these places in the deep interiors of the far areas of the Americas continent won't be discovered for a century or more. When Lewis and Clark, by the way, finds the peoples and cultures of the Northwest and places like that, and then tells the people back in the eastern United States what these cultures are like, he has no idea that he's looking at remnants and survivors and rebuilders and people whose cultures had been skeletonized and whose numbers reduced by 80 to 95%. There's never been anything like that. In his book, The Slave Trade, author Hugh Thomas calls it a population collapse. I'm always fascinated with things like the Black Death in Europe, but 85 to 95% numbers is much worse than the Black Death. And what's so fascinating about how Europe and places affected by the Black Death, or maybe you could even go back and say the Justinian Plague earlier than that, is what they do to societies. it's not just the number of people who die. It starts destroying the framework of societies. The religious bedrock sorts of elements, the interaction between human beings, the hierarchies. I mean, everything gets turned upside down, and societies become unstable. And the survivors are like traumatized sometimes for generations. And then when it comes back again and takes out the survivors, well, as Charles C. Mann had written about these diseases, and I mean, this is the closest you'll ever find to a literal version where you could use the term Pandora's box and have it apply, because when the Europeans show up, and it's not just the first, crop of them, I mean, it's this establishing this regular back and forth is what really, because the Vikings didn't spread a germ catastrophe, right, when they were here in the 1020s, but when it gets going, it involves all the diseases against a population that's never had any of them. Charles C. Mann wrote, quote, "It was as if the suffering these diseases had caused in Eurasia over the past millennia were concentrated into the span of decades," end quote. In his book Inhuman Bondage, a historian of slavery, David Breon Davis, puts it this way to give you a sense of, I mean, if this is a Pandora's box of bad things that can happen to you, what exactly are these bad things named? What's in the box? Davis writes, quote, "The Amerindians throughout the hemisphere had little capacity for resisting imported diseases, both temperate and tropical pathogens, including smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, influenza, typhus, and the plague. Given the previous isolation of the Western Hemisphere, this disaster has been called a virgin soil pandemic. Even whites," he writes, "suffered heavy mortality. Of the 2,500 colonists who arrived in Hispaniola in 1502, 1,000 died in a fairly short period of time. But the Spaniards were bewildered," he writes, "and some even horrified, as the Indian population seemed to evaporate before their eyes," end quote. He also writes that they couldn't just compensate for the disease deaths by increasing the birth rate, because the people of childbearing years were as badly affected as the old and the young. Took out everybody. In terms of numbers, well, because no one knows how many people were in the Americas in the pre-Columbian era, and nobody has a good idea of numbers or percentages, and some of this stuff, I mean, you keep your fingers crossed, might be answered by DNA-type stuff in the future. But Davis writes, quote, "While specialists differ with respect to numbers, which are necessarily somewhat speculative, we are clearly considering the greatest known population loss in human history, that is, mortality as a percentage of population. The population of central Mexico may well have fallen by almost 90% in 75 years. Estimates for Peru and Chile," he writes, "where the diseases spread well before the arrival of Europeans, are almost as high. The death rate was even worse in the Caribbean," he writes, "where pestilence coincided with the encomienda system and much mass slaughter. Estimates of Hispaniola's pre-Columbian Arawak, and I believe it's Taino, Indian population range from about 300,000 to 500,000. By the 1540s, there were fewer than 500 survivors," end quote. Now, the thing about the germ catastrophe is that for the most part, I'm sure we can quibble, and there's ways you could argue that it would impact numbers one way or the other, but for the most part, it wouldn't have mattered who showed up or what their values were to initiate first contact. This germ catastrophe holocaust is happening anyway. The people who first showed up could have been angelic pacifists, and you're still going to lose. Let's pretend you can make it better by having a different relationship. You're still going to lose 7 out of 10. It's a Holocaust any way you look at it. But of course, the people that showed up to initiate first contact are not angelic pacifists. They are, in fact, quite the opposite. And there's a sense here, part of it because Columbus is lucky. I mean, if you believe the accounts, he's landed in the Garden of Eden. He could just as easily have landed in some island full of cannibals, or, he could have gotten really unlucky and landed in one of those areas of the Americas that have organized states with organized militaries and people ready to resist and fight, and lots of them. Instead, he lands into a place where the native indigenous peoples there are almost hopelessly tame and submissive and passive and friendly and sharing and open and curious and innocent. Look at the time period these people coming from the old world come from. Let's remember, you would think that history would always be moving in one direction and we'd be getting less and less terrible to each other over time, right? Surely things being done to each other in this time period are not as bad as when we were practically animals in the very distant past, but you'd be surprised. Those of you who know this period well know what I'm talking about. I mean, the area, you talk from like 1400 to 1700, it's brutal. And people have been trying to figure out why forever. The culprit that is the usual suspect, although people make arguments, is religion, because this is when you have the great split in Western Christianity, Protestantism and Catholicism, and that sort of turns the fire up, maybe literally, in the intensity level and the philosophical wars and the worldview and the hatred for each other and the sense that the stakes are biblical in nature. The point is, go look at the way the Spanish behave in the Netherlands. Go look at how the Turks behave in the Balkans. Go look at the 30 Years' War and the apocalyptic scene that is. Go look at the English in Ireland. Go look at how about this? A generation before Columbus's birth, Tamerlane's running around just east of here and, killing 15 to 20 million people. These people come from the geopolitical equivalent of the Serengeti Plain. You're going to unleash them in the Galapagos Islands, and the indigenous flora and fauna there are going to become endangered pretty quickly. We obviously don't have the indigenous people's account of these happenings, but we do have the accounts of people who were their defenders. I mean, I'm thinking of one Dominican Spanish friar in particular, named Bartolomé de las Casas, who is known as the defender of the Indians. He's a famous figure in places like South America even today. In Spanish circles, he has a more mixed heritage, because who's going to love a person that paints the country in such a negative light? There's something known as the Black Legend, which is a contention among some historians that the enemies of Spain, be they geopolitical enemies like the English or the Dutch, or religious enemies like the Protestants of all stripes, conjured up this terrible legend of Spanish cruelty that isn't deserved. And Bartolomé de las Casas' work is often cited as sort of the fountainhead, right, the origin of the Black Legend. I was trying to research this a little bit, and I stumbled upon one historian who, the minute I read her sort of evaluation of the situation, it sort of rang true to me. So that what she had said was that the Black Legend itself, in terms of the facts on the ground, is probably true. What's going on in the Americas, for example, that people like Bartolomé de las Casas talks about, but that the reason it's unfair and sort of propagandistic is by singling out the Spanish as somehow unusually cruel and different. These people, these other countries that were often singling out the Spanish, were hiding the fact that they themselves have a history in the Americas and amongst the slave trade and all these things that have every bit as dark moments and black marks as the Spanish stuff. So it's unfair to single them out for behavior all these European colonial powers will be engaged in one way or the other. But de las Casas talks about the Spanish treatment of the natives, aside from the whole disease question, and he basically portrays them just the way we suggested, like predators used to fighting and dying over the water hole in the Serengeti, who are unleashed upon people that de las Casas refers to as gentle lambs, always portrayed in a sort of a Garden of Eden light, and maybe the beginnings of some of these ideas of the noble savage trope. And de las Casas says, quote, "It was upon these gentle lambs, imbued by their Creator with all the qualities we have mentioned, that from the very first day they clapped their eyes on them, the Spanish fell like ravening wolves upon the fold, or like tigers and savage lions who have not eaten meat for days. The pattern established at the outset, he writes, has remained unchanged to this day, and the Spaniards still do nothing, save tear the natives to shreds, murder them, and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering, and distress, tormenting, harrying, and persecuting them mercilessly. We shall in due course describe some of the many ingenious methods of torture that they've invented and refined for this purpose. But one can get some idea of the effectiveness of their methods from the figures alone. When the Spanish first journeyed there, he writes, the indigenous population of the island of Hispaniola stood at some 3 million. Today only 200 survive. The island of Cuba, which extends for a distance almost as great as that separating Valladolid from Rome, is now to all intents and purposes uninhabited. And 2 other large, beautiful, and fertile islands, Puerto Rico and Jamaica, have been similarly devastated. Not a living soul remains today on any of the islands in the Bahamas, he writes, which lie to the north of Hispaniola and Cuba, even though every single one of the 60 or so islands in the group, as well as those known as the Islands of Giants and others in the area, both large and small, is more fertile and more beautiful than the royal gardens in Seville, and the climate is as healthy as anywhere on earth. The native population, which once numbered some 500,000, was wiped out by forcible expatriation to the island of Hispaniola, a policy adopted by the Spanish in an endeavor to make up losses amongst the indigenous population of that island. End quote. So what this Dominican friar is saying is that already the Spanish are trying to figure out workarounds to their labor issue as people disappear on some islands. They go get them from other islands and bring them in, which depopulates the old islands, and then they die in the mines anyway. So, you can only keep that up for so long. Now, the actual reading of de las Casas's work is nightmarish. I was going to include one of the really horrible scenes de las Casas talks about. He's very graphic. It's Einsatzgruppen level stuff. Really horrible. But you can't differentiate one from another. And some of these things he saw himself and some he more heard about. But it's as bad as anything you can listen to. And it completely helps explain why, in addition to disease, there would be less and less of the natives. If not only are you killing them, but you're scaring the heck out of them, they're going to leave. So these islands being depopulated is due to several things, including these people fleeing. Who wouldn't flee? But then you add to that the fact that when the Spanish start using the indigenous peoples that they have left for the purposes that they have in mind, right, the creation of the processing plant that will turn these green bananas into usable yellow bananas, the work kills the natives. And de las Casas talks about that. And he links it to these organized butcheries, because he will basically say that after the men are all killed, the Spanish will take what's left, and those are the people that get put to work. And de las Casas says, quote, after the fighting was over and all the men had been killed, the surviving natives, usually that is, the young boys, women, and the children, were shared out between the victors. One got 30, another 40, a third as many as 100, or even twice that number. Everything depended on how far one was in the good books of the despot who went by the title of governor. The pretext under which the victims were parceled out in this way was that their new masters would then be in a position to teach them the truths of the Christian faith. And thus it came about that a host of cruel, grasping, and wicked men, almost all of them pig-ignorant, were put in charge of these poor souls, and they discharged this duty by sending the men down the mines, where working conditions were appalling, to dig for gold, and putting the women to labor in the fields and on their masters' estates, to till the soil and raise the crops, properly a task only for the toughest and strongest of men. Both women and men were given only wild grasses to eat and other unnutritious foodstuffs. The mother of young children promptly saw their milk dry up and their babies die, and with the women and the men separated and never seeing each other, no new children were born. The men, he writes, died down in the mines from overwork and starvation, and the same was true of the women, who perished out on the estates. The islanders, previously so numerous, he writes, began to die out, as would any nation subjected to such appalling treatment. End quote. In his book, The Slave Trade, author Hugh Thomas calls what's happening in the Caribbean during this time period a population collapse. And it warms the cockles of every humanist's heart to hear somebody screaming out about the injustice of it, right into the pages of the history books, to at least represent that there were good people out there that weren't ready to stand for something like this. In the defense of good people, by the way, according to De las Casas himself, when he got to Spain to inform the king of what was going on in the New World, he was talking to Spaniards on the street and people he knew, and nobody had a clue that this was going on. They were completely ignorant of it. Reminds you of stories you hear today about products that you like that are being made by virtual slave labor in some poor country. And with us drowning in more media than you can shake a stick at, we don't hear the story. So not that hard to believe. It is worth pointing out that De las Casas' views on all this stuff will continue to evolve throughout his entire life. And he'll start off as one person. He'll evolve into a sort of a middle version of himself. And then by the end of his life, he will renounce some of the things that he believed in the middle version of his life. He starts off as a guy who arrives in the New World. His father was there like right after Columbus, brought De las Casas as a kid, who goes to the New World perfectly, seemingly ready to become one of those colonists, right? He's going to own slaves. I think he actually maybe did. He's going to live that lifestyle. And then there's a couple of things that just change him. One was he was an eyewitness to the conquest of the island of Cuba, which seems to have shaken him to his core. He said something like he saw things there that no one should ever see. And then he has a famous incident, and I don't know how true any of this stuff is. They all have a sort of a George Washington chopping down the cherry tree sort of ring to them. At the same time, it's often cited as the seminal moment in his life, like when the light bulb goes off over his head. And again, whether or not that's true is questionable. But I love it because it's another example of somebody even before De las Casas speaking out sort of to the gods of history and leaving some example of a light in the darkness back then, of somebody complaining about the inhumanity and injustice of the way people were being treated. And it's recounted in the introduction to the Penguin version I have of De las Casas' a short account of the destruction of the Indies. It's written by historian Anthony Pagden, and he writes, quote, "The story is now a famous one. That morning, a recent arrival on the island, the Dominican Antonio Montesinos, delivered a sermon in the Church of Santo Domingo. Taking his text from St. John, he drew an analogy between the natural desert, in which the evangelist had chosen to spend his life, and the human desert, which the Spaniards had made of the once fruitful, quote-unquote, paradisical island of Hispaniola. He then turned upon the colonists," now quoting the friar, quote, "With what right," he demanded of them, "and with what justice do you keep these poor Indians in such cruel and horrible servitude? By what authority have you made such detestable wars against these people who lived peacefully and gently on their own lands? Are these not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as yourselves?" Pagden then writes, quote, "The last three questions were to become the reference of every subsequent struggle to defend the rights of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. For Las Casas in particular, the third, 'Are you not obliged to love them as yourselves?' was to guide his actions for the rest of his life." End quote. Now, as I said, De las Casas' views will continue to evolve for the rest of his life, and he won't believe at the end of his life what he believes in the middle of his life, just like he didn't believe in the middle of his life what he believed earlier on. In the middle of his life, he thinks he has an answer to how to stop this population collapse and this injustice. His answer is to bring in other people to do the work that is killing the indigenous people. And the other people he thinks should be brought in to do this are Africans from sub-Sahara, black Africa. A couple decades later in his life, he will decide that no one should be slaves, But during this time period, he thinks that this is the humanitarian answer. And what's so hard for us to get our minds around is that it actually probably is some sort of an advance, but it's a 16th century version of a moral humanitarian advance, which doesn't look like much of an advance to those of us in the 21st century. There's also an element here of throwing one group of human beings under a bus in order to improve the humanitarian circumstances of another group of people. I read something recently, and I don't know if it was Fernando Cervantes' book on conquistadors, a new book he has out, but it was talking about the extra responsibility that the Portuguese and the Spanish felt in this area because they were the ones who had to write the original laws, as compared to something like in Africa where there was already an ongoing slave trade and they were just essentially customers. So compare it to a drug situation. It's one thing to be buying drugs from the manufacturer or from a middle person. It's another thing to be setting up your own meth labs. And so some of this appears to be discussions over a different level of culpability here and a lack of laws on how you run things, right? It's not up to the Spanish or the Portuguese how the African rulers in Africa handle the beginnings of the slave trade, but here at Ground Zero in the Caribbean, it is. You have to organize it from the get-go, so things are a little bit different. And you can, if you look for them, find clear evidence of trying to somehow be something like humanitarian. A lot of the laws strike us as nibbling around the edges and get frustrating. And a lot of times these laws that look like they're done for the welfare of the natives are in fact a sound business decision. Sometimes those two things dovetail. For example, keeping the natives healthy works in favor of both the Dominican friars who are advocating for their welfare and the business people who would like to see their product show up to market in good shape, commanding the highest available price. So when in 1513 the Portuguese pass a rule saying that you can't have more than a certain number of slaves on a slave ship, that is both a humanitarian benefit, because if you're on the slave ship, you'll be glad you're not as packed tightly to your neighbor as you otherwise might be, but it's a good business practice too. I mean, if we were talking about tomatoes here, you'd rather have them show up to market unbruised and in the best shape, right? So sometimes what might appear to be humanitarian in nature might just be a money question too, and it's not always easy to disentangle those things. Now, there is a huge move made by the rulers in Spain when they eliminate slavery in the New World, make a rule no slavery, so the people on the ground just come up with ways around it, including the fact that there's exceptions to the rule. I think it was Queen Isabella that said something like, okay, no slaves unless they're cannibals. And so all of a sudden, all these slaves that are working on these plantations in the Caribbean just happen to be cannibals. See how that works? But it's affecting the labor pool nonetheless. And people who are not humanitarians, people that are worried only about the bottom line, right? The figures, the profits, the accounting, those people notice right away too that we better be talking about replacement workers, and those replacement workers are probably going to have to come from Africa in his book, The Slave Trade, which is heavily geared toward the economics of it all. Hugh Thomas writes, quote, "A fillip to the African slave trade was naturally given by the trend towards the outlawing of Indian slavery in the Americas as a result of the agitation of Bartolomé de las Casas and other Dominicans. An indication of the mood in 1544 is shown by a letter of Cristobal de Benavente, public prosecutor of the Supreme Court in Mexico, to the king." Now quoting the letter to the king, quote, "Every day the gold mines are giving less profit because of the lack of Indian slaves. In the end, if your majesty abolishes local slavery," wrote Benavente, "there will be no alternative to allowing blacks into the land, at least in the mines." End quote. Now that's from Mexico, where there was a ton of movable wealth when the Spanish conquered that area. But once you take away all the stuff that's there, I mean, the gold that's sitting out in buildings and decorations, I mean, the movable wealth, then it's all about, okay, how do we get the the wealth out of the land? How do we turn the green bananas into yellow bananas? And if there's not going to be natives, somebody's got to do the work. And as we had said, it was only a generation before that the Europeans have tapped into this African slave trade. And the Africans are an alternative for any number of reasons. The first one, and the most obvious, is they're there, right? There's a huge demand explosion during this period, and there's labor there. So that might be the number one reason. But there's a bunch of other reasons, and it contributes to some very uncomfortable realities, including, once again, treating human beings as though they're non-human and having an exchange rate that reminds one of a currency exchange rate, right? How many dollars to the pound? How many Deutschmarks to the franc? How many yen to the ruble? How many Indian slaves to the African slave? This is like a landmine, and I feel like we're going to encounter these all throughout this discussion. And so I thought of how we should approach these cultural landmines, these issues that can explode in our faces because they're a combination of offensive, we're dealing with people with a completely different mindset. There's a bunch of things that go into this, and I thought we're going to deal with it together. We're going to go up to this landmine, we're going to look at it, we're going to look at it from all sides, we're going to unravel and try to untangle what's going on here. How do we untangle something like this? Famed historian of slavery David Breon Davis in Inhuman Bondage has this line, and what this essentially is something that historians can see written down. This isn't anecdotal evidence. This is the exchange rate, the human exchange rate from one type of human with one color skin and from one culture to another type of human with another color skin from another culture. Davis writes, quote, "Throughout the New World, colonists agreed that the labor of one black was worth that of several Indians." End quote. Now, when Davis says colonists, in this case he means early first contact colonists, so the Spanish in the Caribbean, the Portuguese in Brazil, and the going rate is multiple Indians for every African. Now, in an earlier era, people like the Greeks and Aristotle and whatnot might consider that a sign right there that you should be a slave. Obviously, they're good at it. They make good slaves. That's a sign that they're in that class of people born to be slaves. And if you go to like the antebellum South in maybe the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they'll make it a totally racial question, right? Well, that's just how, that's the ethnicity, that's the genes, and you can see it in the people, and they're just born that way. The concept of race as we understand it today develops during this era. And if it's valuable to learn about this era, if for no other reason than that, considering the importance of the concept of race in our modern world. Before this time period, it wasn't like people were all kumbaya and that they didn't notice, the difference between us and them. The them group was just a lot bigger, and your skin color was only one of many things that played into it. For an ancient Greek, someone who was black from Africa, they would call them Ethiopians, probably. That was in the ancient world. The Greeks would have maybe thought of them as Ethiopians. Sure, they might have had some issues with them, but just like they had issues with the Scythians and the Thracians and the Epirites and the Persians, I mean, this difference in color that separates people of every nationality into groups of people that are only designated by their skin tone, that comes from this era. Modern historians have done a wonderful job, though, if we can deactivate this landmine in front of us, explaining why you might pay more if you were a slave owner, or might have to pay more for a sub-Saharan African slave than a Native American slave. And it has to do with completely logical and understandable reasons that we would understand today in the free labor market, simply based on the value to the employer. That's what we'd say in the free labor market, simply based on the value to the slaveholder. It's what we'd say in the unfree market. I mean, consider this, for example. Besides the fact that the labor is there, which is huge, Africans come from the old world, which means that a lot of the things that people take for granted amongst people of the old world includes the Africans. I mean, they understand things that just come with the territory, that everyone would be expected to know, and if you didn't know them, it would impede your ability to be a functional worker or slave. I mean, how about horses? You go to the New World, and remember, they don't know about horses. They don't know about cattle. These are both things that are a very big deal. I mean, horses are cars and trucks and planes and railroads all rolled into one in this period. If you had a worker or a slave who couldn't ride a horse, couldn't care for a horse, was scared of horses, I mean, that would make them a lot less valuable right there than someone from the old world. And there were several African tribes, sub-Saharan African tribes, that were famous for dealing with horses. Well, right there, you'd pay more for someone who could deal with horses in the free market if you're running a ranch than someone who can't. What about agriculture? Large-scale agribusiness. In the New World, they, of course, planted things and did farming, but there was a lot of hunting and gathering going on. It was a much less rigorous agribusiness kind of style, and the people there didn't know what they were doing when you started to put them into giant teams of workers under overseers. I mean, but in Africa, they had large-scale agribusiness, and they grew all kinds of stuff. In fact, they grew things in Africa that the Europeans wanted to grow in the New World, but didn't know how to grow very well in the New World, so the Africans showed them how. Rice was a perfect example. So once again, if we're talking about free labor here, and you're trying to hire someone for your rice growing business, do you hire someone who doesn't know how to grow rice, has never worked in agribusiness, or do you hire someone who's worked on many farms, knows how to grow rice, and knows how to grow rice so well, they're going to show you how to grow it? All of a sudden, it's not too hard to see why one African slave might be worth more than multiple Indian slaves. There was another reason that was brought up to me that I hadn't thought about that was very interesting, and I forgot. I apologize. I should have written down where I'd seen it, but someone had made the point that when you're talking about original slaves, we're not talking about second generation, third generation. You're talking about people who are captured in Africa, and my thanks to Brenda E. Stevenson, a historian who wrote What is Slavery?, where she reminds us that the trauma that is slavery starts much earlier in the process than we think it does. The actual capture can be extremely traumatic, and the time between capture and making it to the coast to get on the slave ship is often, well, more severe and traumatic than what most of us ever deal with in our lives. And that's before they even get on the slave ship, right? Which, as we know, is awful in its own right. But the people that are being captured in Africa are often being captured in wars. And the people you are getting are often warriors. These are soldiers. And with that comes all kinds of things. And as I was making a list of these things and as I was reading historians talking about them, you couldn't help but notice there's a lot of crossover in what would make a valuable soldier to a commander and what would make a valuable slave to a slave owner or a laborer to a free, employer. I mean, take, for example, physical fitness. These are people that have taken care of their bodies. They've trained. They've worked out. They're in good shape. They're strong, right? They've probably done calisthenics and exercises and all kinds of things that puts them in good shape to begin with. Then you talk about things like discipline and the ability to, follow commands, work in groups efficiently, command others like an officer, and the ability to be tough and resilient. I mean, these are all qualities that work in soldiering and in a labor force, free or slave. And finally, the Africans from sub-Saharan Africa have a superpower, and there's no other way to put it. A superpower that has served them well for millennia, and now, in a terrible, nasty, ironic twist, makes them a better laborer in the New World also. And I've always thought of it as sort of an invisible, pathogenic force field over their entire region of Africa. And the diseases that this force field contains within it kills outsiders reliably. I mean, it keeps the riffraff out of Central and Southern Africa, if you're looking at it from a native who's had to live with these diseases from time immemorial. Now, that doesn't mean Central Africans, for example, don't get malaria. They do. They just don't suffer as badly due to the, inherited long-term resistance that they've developed, right? This is standard medical stuff, as we all know. But it means that the natives are less affected by it than outsiders. Go look at your classic history of the pith helmet wearing white explorers going into deepest, darkest Africa and how lethal that is for them. During this time period, the Portuguese are going to start setting up forts / trading posts / holding areas for slaves all up and down the African coast, right off the mainland, and the people that are stationed there are going to die in droves also. I actually remember an ongoing discussion back in college with the other history majors, the history geekerati, over whether or not Alexander the Great could have conquered Central and Southern Africa. I was on the side of the people who said that he could not, because his whole army would have died from the disease, was my argument. Forget the Sahara. I'm enough of an Alexander fan to think he could have handled the logistical nightmare that would have been. But there is no logistical defense against, malaria or, the truth of the matter is if Alexander's army and Alexander had died from disease in Africa, Alexander probably would have ended up dying then from the same thing that actually killed him in Babylon, which nobody knows what that is. Some people, think it's poisonous and nefarious, but if it wasn't, it was probably one of those diseases like malaria that would have destroyed a Macedonian army had it ever made it to sub-Saharan Africa. But the point being that when the Africans are taken to the Americas, to the New World, they don't die anywhere near as quickly as the Native American, the indigenous peoples do, and they don't even die as quickly as the Europeans do. This is a super valuable commodity, obviously, if you own people, because you'd rather have one that lived longer than one or two or three that didn't. Now, is this going to work in the favor of the African slave? Heck no. It's going to be something that actually prolonged the agony of slavery, meant they got to live longer before they expired on the job. In some of these places, they were able to rationalize not even taking the investment money that would be used to make life a little easier on their slaves, because since they were going to die anyway, the investment wasn't even worth it, just work them to death, and they did. So that's the very long-winded and multifaceted examination of how the heck Africans got stuck into this logistical supply line that was developing now between these two worlds that, up until recently had not been connected or even known of each other's existences. Now, just because you have African labor in the Americas starting doesn't mean Native American slavery died out. In fact, there's going to be quite a bit of it. They may not work well in the mines or the agribusiness area, but there's plenty. If you're an enslaver, I read that word in one of the new histories, and it's being used in place of slave owner, enslaver. It's a lot harsher, but probably should be, right? So if you're an enslaver, there's plenty of jobs on your farm or in your household or in your kitchen or who knows. We forget the element that the hidden between the lines element of sex slavery and the whole slavery question, but it's enormous. So lots of things that one would find the native population valuable for, even if they couldn't do the sort of jobs that they're bringing in old world people to do. And I think it's worth for a second examining the numbers a bit in what we're talking about here. Time to zoom out now that we've laid the foundation for how it got this way to what it is and how it develops. Historian Brenda A. Stevenson from UCLA, whom we quoted earlier in her book, What is Slavery?, goes over the numbers a little bit. And these are all difficult to figure out occasionally because sometimes the records are great and sometimes they're not. But she says that most of the historians dealing with this subject now agree that some 28 million Africans were enslaved and sold between the 15th and 19th century. So that's the 1400s and the 1800s. And she says, quote, approximately 12.5 million left for the Americas and the Caribbean. About 16 million purportedly were traded, not across the Atlantic, but rather to North Africa, on the coast of the Indian Ocean, and throughout the Middle East. But the 11 million or so who arrived in the Americas did not account for the millions, some believe at least 4 million, who died as part of the slave-raiding warfare during the forced marches to the slave-trading coasts, or who perished in the Middle Passage, the ocean trip from Africa to America, as a result of scurvy and other diseases, dehydration, starvation, harsh treatment, or suicide. Nor does it measure, she writes, the millions who lost their homes and families and who were physically displaced as a result of the trade, end quote. And you can trace the development of all of this so economically. As I said, this is what makes the whole period seem like it's beyond its sell-by date. The mind sort of, you have to shake your head out of the lethargy when you just assume we're talking about free labor here, but you're not. I mean, you can see how the slave numbers go into orbit in terms of a growth curve as soon as some of these early places in the New World start churning out the first really popular yellow bananas, right? The green bananas turn into the yellow bananas. And the yellow banana in this case is probably sugar. It is hard to get your mind around what a big deal sugar could be. Not a big deal now. I mean, it's just in everything. It's ubiquitous. You don't even think about it. It's not that expensive. But what if it was? What if they only made it in a few places, and what if there was no good alternatives? Can you imagine the value of this? What would you pay, right? People would go to war over this. I mean, it's fascinating to think about something that it's like thinking about pepper in terms of value. It doesn't even compute. You have to think of oil. You have to think of something that's really big in our world. Now, the point is all of a sudden there's a sugar boom when, Europe and other places all of a sudden develop this huge appetite for something they didn't have a huge appetite for before. They have to have it, and it doesn't grow in a lot of places. Even before Columbus makes his trip to the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese have some islands from the earlier age of discovery stuff that, leads step by step to Columbus. And the ones that are out sort of off the African coast or out into the Atlantic a bit can grow sugar. And so they instantly start turning those places into, little growth centers. But they're going to pale in comparison to what's going to happen in the Caribbean and in Brazil, where these places turn into sugar factories run by human labor and churning out wealth of the sort that can keep whole countries afloat. But the demand for labor is never ending, whereas in the Americas you will have a very unique situation in North America during the famous American slave period, where slaves are able to keep their population levels up through marriage and birth rate. That happens in very few other places. Normally, this is a one-way trip, and children are not part of the deal. Historian David Breon Davis put it this way, and this is his, by the way, it's a little bit of a long quote, but it's his way of describing the green banana, yellow banana thing. The coming in and taking the movable wealth first and then figuring out, okay, what's the long-term wealth in this place and how do we get to it? And he writes, quote, "While Europeans settled each New World colony in a special and often fortuitous way, we can also see a more general pattern being repeated from Hispaniola and Brazil in the 16th century to Virginia and Carolina in the 17th. First," he writes, "we note a strongly human element of greed, a desire for instant wealth from gold and silver, whether stolen from Indians, seized from the Spaniards by Dutch, British, or French pirate ships, or gained from forcing Indians to work in the mines for mineral wealth." He continues, though, and here's the green bananas, quote, "In a second and usually later alternative, colonial leaders turned to cash crops, such as tobacco and especially sugar, produced by slaves imported from Africa after initial experiments with Indian labor. For reasons we will later examine, the African workers could never come close to reproducing their numbers, except in the Chesapeake in the 1720s and in South Carolina a half-century later. Hence, he writes, the need for a continuing and growing stream of labor from Africa to make up for the slave mortality and to clear new land and found new colonies for cultivation. Much of the New World, then, came to resemble the death furnace of the ancient god Moloch, consuming African slaves so increasing numbers of Europeans, and later white Americans, could consume sugar, coffee, rice, and tobacco. End quote. That might sound harsh to some people, but one could make the case that that still applies today. We just have, slave labor or close to slave labor in some places producing supplies that not just Americans anymore, but everybody uses and consumes. We're still addicted to bondage. The terms may be a little different, though, and the benefits more spread out. And this is a good time, now that we've sort of laid the foundation for how did this even come to be, to take a more Blitz edition-oriented approach here. Because, as I said, I'm not qualified to give you the history of slavery, but we could sure talk about some of the really interesting aspects of it. And the first one here is this lack of an ability, and maybe it's just me, and maybe I lack the imagination, but I'm sharing with you the fact I'm having a hard time seeing really plausible counterfactuals in this situation. Other alternative things that might have taken place as opposed to this nightmarish outcome. Because there's counterfactuals that are really easy to imagine. The classic one we always play with in the United States, maybe they do in Britain too, is what if the British had won the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War? Because that could easily have happened. It's not that hard to imagine. That's literally a sort of a turn of fortune kind of thing. Whereas something like imagining a significantly different unfolding of the New World, first century or two, that to me looks more like a mudslide, like a force of nature sort of deal, where the best intentions of the most humanitarian of people in any of these societies would be drowned out by the sheer crush of momentum of the time. We didn't even talk about it, but it's only a couple years, I think, after Columbus finds the Caribbean, thinking he's found Asia, as he would have called it, when somebody actually goes the other way, Vasco da Gama, around Africa into the Indian Ocean, and does find Asia, in air quotes, precipitating what I think is probably, you have to adjust for inflation and all that sort of financial nonsense, but I think you can easily say precipitating the greatest financial boom in the history of humankind. Globalization 1.0, right? All of a sudden, the whole world is connected with trade routes, with regular shipping. It had, the money that could be made. And you're already, as we said, transitioning from a period where things like your name and your birth and your aristocracy and your blue blood and all that stuff really mattered as to whether or not you could participate in a lot of different things. And that was being blown open by all kinds of things. Professors will tie it into the plague and population. There's bazillions of ways to try to untangle the rope that represents the zeitgeist in this era. But money's not a bad way to sort of frame it. I think where you can judge humanity is how quickly you bounce back. If this is like an inevitable mudslide that's going to bury a lot of people in this first contact sort of period, how long does it take you to morally, in a humanitarian sort of collective sense, to dig your way out of the mudslide, right? How long till you rebound from this tragedy that's a creation of forces that no one had ever seen before, infused with mentalities that are only very recently having the Middle Ages reflected back to them in their historical rearview mirror. But these kingdoms and empires and states are all in direct competition with each other in places like Europe, and when the Americas are discovered, the entire competition just seeps over the Atlantic Ocean into the New World. And if the Spanish and the Portuguese thought they were going to keep the New World all to themselves just because they got there first, they're crazy. History geeks like yours truly always enjoy talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas, the one where the Pope brokers this deal where the Portuguese and the Spanish get to divide the undiscovered planet in two between them. Thinking that they're going to actually make this deal stick with the rest of the countries of the world is nuts. It does have an effect, though. I mean, the reason the Portuguese kind of have a stranglehold on the African Atlantic trade stuff is because they're the ones who get, according to that treaty, control of the West African coast, where they're building all those forts/holding pens. So it has an effect, but the English, who will become the British in the early 1700s, right, as part of this changing from kingdoms into states, they're not going to pay any attention to this. And once there's the religious schism, between Catholicism and Protestantism, the people that leave Catholicism don't pay any attention to anything the Pope says anyway. So they don't care. We're not staying out of the Americas, right? All these other countries are going to crash the American private party. They're just going to be a little behind places like Spain the whole time. I mean, Spain will be in like California and Texas, in the not too distant future. Remember, it's going to take hundreds of years to explore all this new country, and the other European powers will be about 50, 75, 100 years behind them every step of the way. So the Spanish and the Portuguese get this head start, and then when the other countries arrive, they have all these ways to make up for the lost time, though, like stealing the Spanish stuff through piracy. This is the Great Age when all the pirates are around. Really, the period from about 1492 when Columbus stumbles on the Americas and about 1800 is the period in which you look at this area and you see the giant risk board New World version. And all these islands change hands and warfare happens and other settlements and the French get involved, the British get involved, the Dutch get involved. You even see the Danish and the Norwegians get involved. The price for entry, right? In order to play this New World colonization game, you have to have a significant fleet, right? You have to be a naval power. The countries that get locked out of this giant gold rush, right, the globalization 1.0 gold rush fever time, are places like Central European landlocked countries. Now, there is no Germany at this time, right? Germany's a bunch of different states. It won't coalesce for several hundred years. But what that means is there's no giant German state with a German fleet that can send the German fleet out there to participate in all this. Why does this even matter? Well, because, in the early 1900s, one of the complaints that led to the First World War was this idea that there were countries that had gotten their, and the phrase was, place in the sun, and then there were these other countries that were left out when all that was taking place, right? The game of musical chairs started before they were even a country. Well, the period where the enemies of the Kaiser's Germany in the First World War were getting their place in the sun is this period. And after the Spanish and the Portuguese take some of these places from the indigenous peoples, the people from the old world come over and start taking it from the Spanish and the Portuguese. It's like the cheetahs were the first arrivals, and they started eating all the peaceful furry plovers in Hispaniola. And then after a significant period of time, but not that long, the lions from the old world arrive and start pushing the cheetahs, deeper into the interior. You'll see these islands change hands between the Spanish and the French and the French and the British, and it's a giant game of musical chairs for a couple centuries. You'll also see the beginnings of settlements into places where the Spanish didn't even go. The Spanish will be in places like Florida, for example, but they won't be in places like Massachusetts or Virginia or what's now part of Canada, but the French and the English will. The Dutch will too. I mean, they settled New York originally, right? New Amsterdam. And all these different peoples are going to bring the general way of doing things, the institutions and the culture from, the European old world. But because of the subtle differences between each of them, right, the English from the French from the Spanish, the development in all these places will be a little bit different. Treatment of the slaves, for example, a little bit different. There'll even be one or two communities that won't even allow slavery in them in North America. But by and large, you get the general consensus that labor is unbelievably necessary and in short supply. And what's also interesting is if you buy into the premise from the primary sources, and I mean from multiple different nations, cultures, eras, over hundreds of years, you can read plea after plea after plea from these people in the Americas writing back to the old country saying, if we don't have more slaves, then we can't settle this place at all. And it didn't necessarily have to be African slaves. This is also the period where the famous indentured servitude era really takes off big. But it doesn't appear that many of these people are talking about free labor in any way, shape, or form. It's either going to be slaves or indentured servants or something like that. And if you take their arguments at face value, and I can't figure out if this is somehow sort of a lack of imagination or the blinders that are put on because these people come from a different era and a different economic system. But if you take their arguments at face value, it's as though they're saying that if the Americas had been found, with the modern era's sort of values in mind, right, where we pay people for work, that it simply wouldn't be settled, or that we'd still be stuck hundreds of years later on the eastern seaboard, still trying to chop down the primeval forests in the east with paid labor. It's interesting to contemplate, right, the what-ifs here and what we're dealing with. One thing you can say, though, is that the numbers are borderline shocking, even for someone who should know better like yours truly. In Inhuman Bondage, David Breon Davis writes, gives you some statistics that show you the amount of people that are coming over from the old world to the new world. And all you can say is, I should have known this. Listen to these numbers and tell me if this doesn't shock you. Davis writes, quote, in retrospect, it appears that the entire New World enterprise depended on the enormous and expandable flow of slave labor from Africa. Though in 1495 Columbus transported some 500 Native American slaves to Seville and dreamed of a profitable slave trade of American quote-unquote Indians to Iberia, Italy, Sicily, and the Atlantic Islands, some African slaves arrived in the Caribbean at least as early as 1501. By 1820, nearly 8.7 million slaves had departed from Africa to the New World, as opposed to only 2.6 million whites, many of them convicts or indentured servants who had left Europe. Thus, he writes, by 1820, African slaves constituted almost 77% of the enormous population that had sailed toward the Americas. And from 1760 to 1820, this emigrating flow included 5.6 African slaves for every European. From 1820 to 1880, the African slave trade, most of it now illegal, continued to ship off from Africa nearly 2.3 million more slaves, mainly to Brazil and Cuba. End quote. That's an astounding number. The majority of people who emigrated to the Americas until 1820 were black. And it wasn't because that's what everybody wanted in terms of a racial makeup in this new world. It's because of the labor shortage, and this was the way these people solved it. Now, I have no evidence to prove it handy, but I would assume this is probably the greatest labor shortage in global history, and you can see changes in the market to fill it over the centuries. As we said, the Portuguese dominate the slave trade early, build all kinds of forts and castles off the coast of Africa, become the initial people running this thing, build the foundation, build the infrastructure. But then at some point, the Dutch will sort of supplant them. And then after that, the British will supplant the Dutch in terms of dominating the slave trade. And all these governments, we should point out, tax it. Right? They tax the slave ships, they tax the transactions. So the government is making money directly off the slave trade, and then they pour that into, everything you can think of, including building the infrastructures of a lot of these cities in Europe, right? And in the New World too. But it gives them a vested interest in the slave trade, doesn't it? And over time you can see that the people who are being made slaves will change, and the labor shortage will be handled by different groups. Initially, as we said, around Columbus's time period and soon afterwards, the slave numbers are dominated by the natives, the indigenous peoples. And then by about the 1600s, you see sort of a rough parity, right? Native peoples forming maybe like a third, and these are rough ballpark estimates, but the natives forming like a third of the slave numbers, indentured servants from Europe, right? People who are essentially temporary slaves forming a third, and Africans forming about a third. Frederick Douglass, who I've always considered to be sort of the black founding father, he's one of the more impressive human beings in American history. If you've not read his autobiographies, he's got more than one. He's just wonderful. And he tells the story of encountering some Irish guys when Frederick Douglass is a slave, and he helps them with some labors that they're doing. And after they're done moving some heavy stuff, the Irish guys find out that Douglass is a slave, or they knew it before, but then they ask him a key question. They say, "Are ye a slave for life?" Meaning that the Irish people would probably have been familiar with the indentured servitude idea, where you might be essentially a slave and you could be sold and all those kinds of things, but there's a time limit on it, and after that you're free. Convicts, I think, was usually double the time limit before you're free as a sort of indentured servant. And convicts have formed large chunks of many societies. I mean, Australia had a lot of convicts. The United States had a lot of convicts. As part of the early gene pools. And Douglass had to tell these people, no, that he was a slave for life. And by that means, not only is there no time limit on when you're automatically freed, but your progeny, your kids are slaves too, which the indentured servants, that's not a thing. But after about the 1600s, you can see the demographics change. There will be Native American slavery in some parts of the Americas. Well, some people would argue you still have that, but that's never going away per se. But in the great cities of the American East that are starting to develop, you're not going to see tons of Native American slavery. Even in the areas around the Caribbean, it's going to start to be dominated by, about the late 1600s, early 1700s, by the African slave trade. And the companies that developed to fill this labor need. I mean, we weren't just sort of making a fanciful comparison when we call this sort of early capitalism, monarchical capitalism. It's been described before. I mean, the company that's in Britain that handles the majority of the slave trade is called the Royal African Company. So, I mean, these are slave trading companies. And it's big business because the slaves are doing every kind of job you can think of. In What is Slavery, historian Brenda E. Stevenson says, quote, "By the beginning of the 1600s, the increase in the trade in slaves to accommodate sugar and tobacco production, as well as gold and silver mining, also meant an increase in the numbers of persons in Africa, Europe, and the Americas involved in the trade, and the numbers of New World locales where African workers arrived. Sugar alone," she writes, "accounted for the labor of 70% of the African imported slave labor in the New World over the centuries." End quote. These islands have certainly gone from having the green bananas of Columbus's day to the fully saleable and very valuable yellow bananas in this era, and Stevenson writes, quote, "The expansion of sugar cultivation beyond Brazil in the mid-17th century, particularly to British and French islands in the Caribbean, was especially important in the development of this crop's dominance and the corresponding growth in the numbers of Africans imported to cultivate it. These locales," she writes, "included Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, with planters who dominated the world market, along with the British islands of Barbados, St. Kitts and Antigua, and the French colonies of Martinique and Guadeloupe. Other crops, especially cacao in Brazil and tobacco in Barbados, also fed this early agricultural boom. By the 18th century, coffee and indigo were also important slave-produced exports." End quote. She then goes on to show some of the other jobs being done in places like Brazil, but you could say the same thing about North America. We think of these large plantations and agricultural work, but these people are doing everything. Stevenson says, quote, "While agricultural work was what occupied most enslaved people, they also worked in other sectors of the early colonial economies. Those in the first centuries of the Atlantic trade who came to reside in Brazil, for example, were also miners, herders, domestic servants, carpenters, wheelwrights, fishermen, and lumbermen, or performed other skilled or day labor work. In Spanish-speaking colonial America, particularly Mexico, enslaved 16th century Africans, many like the Akan, I think it's Akan, who were from the gold mining regions of Ghana, worked in gold and silver mines." End quote. Now, Stevenson's talking about Brazil there, but you can say the same thing about North America before the American Revolution, because the northern territories had slaves back in those days too, and they did all kinds of jobs. And the funny thing about it is that what that does is preclude you from having some sort of example that applies to slavery in general, because there is no, I mean, we used to think of it as a classically agricultural thing, right? Picking cotton or harvesting sugar, or God forbid it for everybody. I mean, the mines were the worst, right? The Romans in the ancient world, if they sentenced the slaves to the mines, I mean, it was almost a death sentence. But Frederick Douglass in his autobiography talks about the first time he ever saw a slave in the big city, which for him was Baltimore. He was from a rural plantation, and he says when he got to Baltimore and saw what slaves were like there, he thought they were practically freemen as far as he was concerned, right? No overseer with a whip watching everything they did. And he blamed it on peer pressure, the reason he said that slaves were treated better. He says because none of the masters wanted to look like they mistreated their slaves in front of everyone else. You think about it more like a possession, right? If you have a fancy car, you don't want it to get all run down and look shabby, right? It reflects badly on you. And he was saying, for example, because he was always hungry, it seemed like when I was reading his writings back at home on the plantation, and he said that no one would want to be accused in Baltimore of starving their slaves. And he thought that this peer pressure meant that the average slave had a better life than it had, back on the plantation where no one can see what you're doing to your slaves. Which brings me to, a part of the story that I keep wanting to inject in here so I remember it myself, if that makes sense. But it's a kind of a hidden part, but you can deduce it so easily, right? It's like when they find planets without actually seeing the planet, but they can see that there must be a planet out there based on what's going on with the other ones. I read an article, and it was a writer. I don't remember if she was writing for the New York Times or the Atlantic or something like that, but she'd made a comment about how every time she looked in the mirror, she was reminded of a rape in her ancestral tree somewhere, right? Her very skin color was a lasting legacy to slavery, and it's the sexual assault question that we forget. And that's not an African Atlantic slave trade issue. That's a slavery issue going back to the beginning of recorded history, right? They buy slaves specifically for the concubine aspect of it in some places, but even if that's not what you have them for, the lack of legal protections and oversight and all that kind of stuff means you're going to get that anyway. And what I mean by that is if you're one of those slaves in Baltimore that looks like you're practically a free person to Frederick Douglass, that doesn't protect you. Right? If you're some lady who works in the house where the enslaver lives and you cook for their family and you're practically a member of the household and you celebrate holidays with them and you're up in the privileged realms of the slave society as other slaves would view it, that doesn't mean that when the lights go out at night you're not subjected to sexual assault all the time. In other words, without the legal protections, just because your outward situation seems so much more enviable, no one knows what's really going on here, except as that one woman had said, you can tell by the color of her skin. And the many writings that are made about the fact that everyone knew that the masters are sleeping with the slaves and everyone knew whose mixed race child belonged to whom, but everybody kind of discreetly kept their mouth shut about it. Well, if they were talking to someone who might be the child's stepmother anyway. But needless to say, you didn't have a lot of people writing accounts of this for the history books. That's a problem with a lot of human suffering, right? If you want to have firsthand accounts of what it was like on the slave ship crossing the Atlantic, those are not easy to come by. Those people didn't publish a lot of books. There are some. There's a book I picked up because Brenda Stevenson was quoting from it, called Pioneers of the Black Atlantic, which is several different slave narratives. But they're not always easily quotable kinds of things. What they do show you, though, is where you can't generalize about the slave experience of slaves in the Americas. You can make a distinction between those who were born in Africa as free people and had to make the trip over, and those who were born in the Americas. Like Frederick Douglass is born in the Americas. He never was a free person before becoming a slave. He never had to do that terrible ship travel across the Atlantic. So there's certain things he can't relate to, and that other American-born slaves wouldn't have had to go through, that would have been a shared experience that everyone who came from Africa would have been able to relate to. And one of the things that, sometimes you have to be reminded about things that after you hear about them seem obvious, but you hadn't thought about them. So Brenda Stevenson brings it up, and then after she says it, I'm noticing it everywhere. And it was about what these enslaved people go through before they even arrive at the ships to take them across the Atlantic to the Americas. Because in your mind's eye, you think, oh, well, it starts off, they become slaves, and then they get on their ships, and that's horrible, and then the whole thing starts. No, it starts long before then. And what most of these people will experience between their capturing and the arrival at the coast to get on these ships, any one of their experiences would be the worst experience most of us have ever had. Simply the branding alone would be something that would be in the forefront of your mind today had anybody ever taken a glowing hot piece of metal and stuck it on your skin for a significant period of time, right? And that's just one of the things they get to go through. So Stevenson talks about it, though. She talks about the different ways these people could become enslaved, and there's all sorts of different ways, as I think we alluded to earlier. And before we consider ourselves so morally advanced, let's understand that if I couch it in the right framework, many of you will agree that you'd support a kind of slavery under the right conditions, and it's conditions that the Africans enslaved people under too. If I said that somebody had committed some heinous crime, and that for the rest of their life they were going to have to be involved in hard labor in order to pay society back, a lot of people think that that was a just sentence. And that was a kind of sentence that could get people put into slavery in Africa. There were a bunch of other ones, of course. Simply owing money could get you in trouble. Being a captive in war was a classic. And my Central African history is not good, but I was reading that there was a series of rather large wars between African rulers in the 17th and 18th centuries, the byproduct of which is a lot of slaves to sell afterwards. And so this was working out for everyone, right? We have ground zero production for this logistical supply chain that provides labor for the New World. And as fate would have it, we have a lot of wars creating a lot of product. So get them while they're hot, right? All the African slaves you can transport. And so Stevenson talks about the trip from initially becoming a slave to simply making it to the coast to get on the slave ships, which is normally where we think the bad part starts. Well, that would be wrong. Stevenson writes, quote, "Enslaved Africans, therefore, entered the Atlantic trade through numerous avenues, as sold war captives, kidnapped victims, social outcasts, criminals, as tribute payment, or drawn from a pool of bonded laborers traditionally found in many Western and Central African societies. Some were sold from one locale in Africa to another, and then eventually sold to Europeans bound for the market in the Americas. The trips they took from their earlier places of residence or servitude to the coast for embarkment to the Caribbean or beyond could be hundreds of miles. Often," she writes, "they were sold and resold along the way to the coast. They marched in single or double file, chained to each other with only the clothing they had on when taken, eating and drinking only what their captors provided. Exhausted, undernourished, physically, psychologically, and sexually abused, and often dehydrated as well, some became ill, others perished en route. It was only the beginning of their travails and their travels." End quote. She says then they get put in these giant sort of prison-type facilities awaiting transport after they're sold. And then the transport thing, this also blew me away, and I didn't think about this either because it's not something that occurs to you. So James Walvin in Freedom points out that the key ingredient in terms of how nasty the transport was on these wooden ships from Africa to the New World had to do with how long you had to be on the ships, right? The longer you were on it, the worse it was. Because if you're being tortured, the longer you're being tortured, the worse it is, right? But then he says something that I didn't realize, which is that these ships picked up cargo a little like the airport transport bus often does, where instead of just picking you up and taking you to the airport, it stops at many different stops until it has a full bus, and then it leaves for the airport. So these ships are staying offshore in Africa, off the coast, near the equator, right? So it's hot as hell, with people below decks until they get enough people to leave for the New World. And Walvin gives you a sense of how long it might take before the ship is filled up enough to leave, with people below decks in chains in a coffin-size amount of personal space. And Walvin writes, quote, Africans often spent longer on board a slave ship anchored off the coast of Africa than in crossing the Atlantic. The ships accumulated their human cargoes slowly, from place to place. Where there were no facilities for holding Africans on shore, the ship acted as a floating prison until the master decided that he had had enough enslaved people to set out across the Atlantic. Some ships, little more than hulks, acted as permanent offshore prisons, passing on their captives to other ships ready to sail. In the 17th century, he writes, Dutch ships spent an average of 120 days on the coast, British ships 94. A century later, the Dutch spent an average of 200 days on the coast, French ships 143. In the mid to late 18th century, British ships spent 173 days on the African coast. End quote. He says that one fact that stands out from the wealth of information is that millions of Africans spent months at sea before they even left for the Americas. And if the amount of time you're on board the ship is the key question in terms of whether you live or die or how long the torture continues, you can see that the situation is worse than most of us originally thought. The part of the story I'm a little more familiar with, as most of us are, is the horrors of the crossing itself, because it is so infamous. It's a little like the trips in the closed rail cars to the concentration camps in the Holocaust, where the suffering that goes on while in transit is so famous because it's so terrible. People sort of marked by the experience. Walvin talks about how the slave ships were known to just smell terrible, like cesspits and cesspools, and you could smell them miles away downwind. But to imagine what it must have been like to be chained into a space about the size of a coffin while everyone else is around you doing what everyone else does while just living and surviving for months. The nightmarish side of this is hard to get your mind around. And Walvin points out something, once again, that I didn't even think of. If you want to take the Rashomon approach to all this and see it from every different side, he was pointing out that the people who are the ones who run the slave ship itself, they're often terrified too. And you might have 400 slaves on a ship with 17 crew members, and the 17 crew members can be terrified also. I mean, you're stuck there on board with a lot of desperate people. And if you actually look at slave revolts as a thing, which we'll do in a little while, the vast majority of them happen on board ships within sight of the African coast, because it's sort of the last chance for these people to get away before they're severed from their homeland, and they understand once they're out of sight of land how much their chances drop of ever getting back home again. But the accounts are legendary of what it's like in the holds of these ships, and I picked one out here from someone who went through it. This isn't an author, it's an eyewitness. And when he describes what he calls the necessary tubs are what passes for latrines in these shipboard situations. Another thing Walvin points out that it's worth remembering is that to travel by ship during most of this time period is harrowing for people who pay for the privilege, much less what it's like for slaves. And in the book Pioneers of the Black Atlantic, which is a compilation of several different slave stories, a slave and I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Aladue Equiano, points out what it was like below decks for him when he makes this famous middle passage crossing, and he says, quote, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation," he says, "was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable." End quote. And it goes on for months. Slaves jump overboard to get away from it, committing suicide, some believing that they'll go back to Africa after they die. Some refuse to eat, and as a response are brutally flogged. The slave I just quoted, said that he saw a white sailor flogged so horribly that he died, and that they threw him overboard, basically pointing out that the people that were doing this to the slaves, in his mind, had no human feeling at all and would do this to each other, which scared him even more. And once again, we have the hidden part of this story, which is the rape and the many insinuations of girls and female children and young male children being raped by the crew continuously across the whole journey. So you have these people who are almost dying, whose only time to get out of the hold and out of the chains is to be part of a sexual assault. These stories are about trauma inflicted upon trauma in a way that one has a logical question that one can ask of something like this. How long would it take a family to have the pain and effects of trauma at this sort of a level melt away? I mean, would your children be able to pick out things in their life that are the result of the trauma that you went through in a situation like this? What about your grandchildren? In other words, how long until this sort of pain and suffering, how long till the ripples caused by it die out? And that's assuming, of course, that these people live very long. Tons of them die on the journey. And it's this real catch-22 if you're looking at this from a business sense, because you have a vested interest in packing the ship as closely as you can to get as many pieces of cargo on there as you can, because, of course, that means more to sell. But there becomes a point where you're hurting your own cargo, and they start dying at greater rates if you pack them too much like sardines. So perhaps there's it's funny when you start saying that the only protection these people have in terms of better living conditions is because of their worth as a commodity. Doesn't stop them from being thrown overboard in droves sometimes to collect the insurance money. There's a reason that this middle passage has been so mythologized in the history of slavery, because in terms of horrible experiences that people go through, it is right up there near the top of the list. Able to hold its own with many of the worst things that you can think of throughout history. And we should point out once again that this is something that happens to people who are on their way to becoming slaves. This is sort of the welcoming experience to their new life. One of the things that they do to you in debate class, and I know a lot of you have gone through this too, is to give you a side in a debate that you don't agree with and then force you to defend it. And I imagine if we were in some cosmic court of law and you said that I had to be the attorney representing the past on this slavery question, against the attorney representing the present, I think I'd point out that there's all sorts of laws that I can name from multiple countries over multiple eras that are designed to make this situation better for the enslaved people. I mean, we'd mentioned one of them earlier with the problems Columbus ran into trying to enslave the indigenous peoples of the Americas when the Queen of Castile, who also happened to be the one funding his mission in that little piece of monarchical capitalism, said, why is my admiral enslaving my subjects, right? Well, France had something called the Code Noir in the 1600s. Britain had rules on slave ships and how many slaves you could put on the ship. I mean, the attorney for the past defending history would say, hey, listen, I can cite all kinds of laws, measures, debates, and things that were done to address this very issue. It's not our fault it didn't come far enough to meet your modern standards. We didn't even know what those were, and you wouldn't have gotten anywhere near them if we hadn't taken the early steps like Code Noir and the Queen of Castile and limitations on the number of slaves you can have on ships, and eventually things like going after the slave trade. It's hard, though, because the world is what's the line from Trixie, from Gollum in the Lord of the Rings? It's Trixie, and you don't know exactly what the motivations are, and you have to be careful. I mean, is a limit on the size of slave ship capacity something done for the benefit of the human beings that are the cargo, or are you doing it to protect product? You got to be careful, right? We're human beings. We're a little tricksy. But I think the attorney representing the interests and conduct of the past would say that there are things that they can point to that show that they were trying. If you wanted to critique that from the other side, the lawyer representing modern times would say, well, your enforcement was terrible. When did this ever work out in the favor of the people that the law was supposed to protect? When did anybody ever have to pay any penalties? When was anybody ever discovered, investigated, or taken to task? When did any slave owners go to jail or pay a fine for the treatment of the people they owned? You see what I'm saying is that you can have all the laws on the books. That doesn't mean anything actually happens, but a lawyer representing the past would have some ammunition in saying that they did not totally ignore this issue. But when you see what one of these slave markets are like, when these people arrive on these ships to the Americas, it's impossible not to be critical on how anyone could look at this and think it was okay. I was reading one account, and it was Abraham Lincoln, who's an interesting figure when it comes to slavery, too. An Abraham Lincoln account that was written by someone who was with him once, and this is in the 1850s, so it's quite a bit of time before he becomes president. And they said that they were walking through the city streets somewhere, I'm going from memory here, but that they had chanced upon a slave market where a sale was taking place, and I think it was a woman that was being sold. And Lincoln's friend said his fists would just completely clench and unclench, and his jaw would get tight. And he was saying something to the effect that this was just so wrong on so many levels. It makes one wonder how many people have to have a sort of softening of the heart or a change in outlook before that manifests in a change in society. Because, you can blame anyone from the past you want for the conditions that existed then. The defense could easily be, I'm just one person. What do you think I can do all by myself? The same defense you would probably use if somebody 500 years from now, were critical of something in our era. I mean, how could you people drive cars as long as you did? I'm just one person. What am I going to shut down the car industry? That's how people in the past might have responded to you saying, how could you put up with these slave markets? Look at what this is. These people are like pieces of meat, and if it doesn't make you as mad as it made Abraham Lincoln, what's wrong with you? I mean, listen to these sorts of eyewitness accounts of what the slave market was like. It is fascinating. So they often began at the sound of either a gun going off or a drum being sounded. And people were sometimes nuts. I mean, it reminds you, if you pardon me reducing this to Christmas shopping, but like the craziness you see on television sometimes when people will wait outside a facility until midnight and then everybody goes in and they're, ripping product from, one person to, a sort of a crazed kind of thing, right? Get the best before someone else does. And when you let everybody in at once like that, it's a free-for-all. And this is a free-for-all, of people buying people. In his book, Slavery, A World History, Milton Meltzer describes as sort of a typical slave market sale and says that sometimes the affairs were done privately with an advance sale that had been arranged ahead of time, but normally it was the sort of, doors open at noon at the sound of a gun, grab whatever you can kind of deal. And he says the official name for it among some was the scramble, and he writes, quote, "After the walking skeletons had been disposed of," he means they're really sick. They were sold sort of in bulk right away. Get them out of the way. Less than $1 a slave, obviously, he said, because they often died. And then you bring out the good product. He said, "After the walking skeletons had been disposed of, the healthy slaves came next. Sometimes they would be marched through the town behind bagpipes and drawn up for inspection by planters or their overseers in the public square. If a West Indian factor handled retail sales, he took 15% of the gross and another 5% of the net returns. The quote-end quote scramble, however, was the customary way of handling a sale. By agreement with the buyers, a fixed price was set for the 4 categories of slaves: man, woman, boy, and girl. A day for the sale was advertised. When the hour came, a gun was fired. The door to the slave yard was flung open, and a horde of purchasers rushed in, quote, with all the ferocity of brutes, end quote, said a man named Falconbridge, a slave ship surgeon who witnessed several scrambles. Each buyer, Meltzer writes, bent on getting his pick of the pack, tried to encircle the largest number of choice slaves by means of a rope. The slaves, helpless, bewildered, terrified, were yanked about savagely, torn by one buyer from another. Some were so panicked by one such scramble on the island of Grenada that they hurled themselves over the wall and ran madly through the town. Once, Falconbridge saw a scramble aboard a ship in Kingston Harbor. When the buyers swooped in to seize their prey, about 30 of the slaves leaped into the sea, but all of them were soon fished out. End quote. He then points out that when the slaves were bought a second time, the first time they're bought is on the coast of Africa, and they're branded then. And he says now when they're bought again, they're branded again. The experience of being sold for the Africans arriving from Africa is a little bit different than the experience of being sold for slaves who have already been in the Americas. The difference is usually one of close family relationships. It was rare for the slaves from Africa to be taken with family members and have their company and companionship the whole time. So they weren't as often separated from close family members during the scramble kind of slave sale. But once you get to where you have an internal slave trade, where slaves who are born in the Americas are being sold from one owner to another, well, now you have something that's part of this human disaster here that is the breakup of families, which is part of this huge, huge lingering trauma from slavery. As we said, how long does it take for a family to have the ripples of pain go away? Well, if your skin color is indicative of some of that pain, that makes it very difficult. And if you've had people in your family tree severed from their family, that lasts a long time too. Frederick Douglass talks about one of these sales where he was on a plantation that had been in someone's hands for a while, and then all of a sudden that person had to sell, or they died, I think. And then you have this valuation, how much are the slaves worth as part of the overall estate, and then you liquidate, the assets, right? And he says, quote, "After the valuation, then came the division. I have no language to express the high excitement and deep anxiety which were felt amongst us poor slaves during this time. Our fate for life was now to be decided. We had no more voice in that decision than the brutes amongst whom we were ranked. A single word from the white men was enough, against all our wishes, prayers, and entreaties, to sunder forever the dearest friends, dearest kindred, and strongest ties known to human beings. In addition to the pain of separation, there was the horrid dread of falling into the hands of Master Andrew. He was known to us all as being a most cruel wretch, a common drunkard who had, by his reckless mismanagement and profligate dissipation, already wasted a large portion of his father's property. We all felt that we might as well be sold at once to the Georgia traders as to pass into his hands, for we knew that that would be our inevitable condition, a condition held by us all in the utmost horror and dread. I suffered more anxiety." End quote. One of the things that I noticed while reading a bunch of different slave accounts is you tended, there were certainly people that met every sort of condition you can imagine, but it seemed to me there was a big division between the slaves that were rarely or never sold, and so their whole lives is in one circumstance, and the slaves that were sold over and over and over again. Douglas is one of those people where every time you're sold, it's like a new chapter in the book that is your life. And it's like rolling the dice. And am I going to go to a sadistic sociopath now, or am I going to go to somebody who graded on the slavery curve isn't so bad? As Frederick Douglass had said, that he always measured the kindness of his master by the standards of the kindness set up amongst slaveholders around them. And so, slavery is graded on a curve. You take slavery as the condition that you have no control over, and then you judge how well you're doing, based on that compared to people in a similar situation. The point of what Douglas was saying, though, that perhaps the Africans had been severed from their families back in Africa. It's not that they don't have this pain, is that it happened pre-voyage over. But the slaves who get to see their children sold away from them, or their spouse, or their parents, well, for some people, you'd rather be dead, wouldn't you? So when we talk about the extremes of the human experience, these are the kind of things that all by themselves would be on the nasty list. But when you realize that this Atlantic slave trade combines numerous things that by themselves would be on your top 10 horrible list, it's a cornucopia of atrocities. And there was nothing, we should point out, to prevent this incident, this type of incident, from happening over and over again during the course of a slave's lifetime, right? I mean, you can have kids after your parents were sold off, and they can be sold off too, or you could be sold. I mean, when you think of the power that this gives a slaveholder over a slave, it's an immense amount of leverage, isn't it? And it may help explain that most hard to get your mind around phenomenon that you will run into with the primary sources of slavery, which is, what do you make of these slaves? And you'll see it, for example, in the primary sources in the United States later. What do you make of the slaves? And it's we should point out, definitely a minority, but who loved their masters or professed that they did. Is this the Stockholm Syndrome at work? Is this romanticizing the past when they were interviewed later? Is this more like what Frederick Douglass was saying, where you're grading this on sort of a slavery curve? And if you had a master that would take into account your feelings about perhaps holding a sale where your children might be sold off and separated from you for life, and an owner who wouldn't give a hoot about that, well, you might develop some sort of weird affection for your owner too, I guess. Somebody who at least gave you the time of day in terms of humanitarian concerns. But it is weird. There's many aspects of slavery that are weird. One thing, though, that we do need to sort of mentally understand, and it's tough because, when you're doing what I'm doing here, and this has always been the problem with history since Herodotus on, is how do you pick examples and things to emphasize, and how do you avoid cherry picking or making something look potentially worse or better than it really was? Because, I can pick nasty, horrific slavery story after nasty, horrific slavery story, and I'm not sure a chronicle of the bad things done to slaves over the eras illuminates us much more above the idea that we can really be awful to each other, and the slavery is one of those things that's horrifying. So what do you get beyond that, though? Well, there's some interesting questions. As I always say, I'm not qualified to give answers, but anyone can ask questions. And a lot of my questions revolve around this idea of a society that figures out a way to transform a significant number of people into slaves and keep them in that condition. Because remember, this is not, one might compare this to business, as we've been doing, and entrepreneurship and trade and all these kinds of things. But at ground zero, once slaves become slaves and end up where they're supposed to be, in terms of final sale, and you're working here and I own you, how does this all keep people working? In a free labor system, you have carrots that you hold out to employees, and if they don't do what you want, you reduce or eliminate them, right? You don't do the kind of job I want, I'm going to lower your pay. You don't do the kind of job I want over a long enough period of time, I'm going to fire you. But what if you're dealing with labor that doesn't want the job in the first place and isn't paid anything? How do you get those people to work? Well, that's where you move from carrots to sticks, literally in some cases. In The World That Fear Made, historian Jason T. Sharples describes this system that's based on force and that is, in a very real, non-exaggerated sense, a system of violence, one that makes sure that slaves end up where they're supposed to go, do the job that they're supposed to do when they get there. If they dare to run away or escape, that will find them, return them to their place of origin in terms of ownership, and then punish them. And then an entire system devoted to preventing any sort of insurrection, rebellion, rising up, or resistance. It's a system, right? We Americans like to poke fun. When I was growing up, we always used to use a fake German accent and poke fun at the Gestapo question, where they would ask a person in Germany, let me see your papers. Because in the United States, of course, being free people who could go wherever you wanted to, that was something we made fun of, except it didn't acknowledge the fact that there were lots of people that had to show their papers or not get in terrible trouble or be beaten or worse, and they were slaves in the South when they were out at night. Part of the system of violence here and the controlling of forced labor required an entire edifice to be developed about this sort of things. The slaves in the United States, when you read the accounts, they had a phrase that I kept running into, and I didn't understand what it meant for the longest time. And the phrase was, sometimes they said patty rollers, and sometimes they said patter rollers. And it didn't make any sense to me until I finally saw it again in context, and it dawned on me. They're saying patrollers. Now, they didn't know what the term meant, so they heard it, and it became sort of a bastardized version of patroller, patty roller, patter roller.